Alrighty, the town of Bay-Westfield Planning Advisory Committee would like to call to order the meeting of Monday, May 2nd, 2022. Land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that Bay-Westfield exists on the traditional Woolastook Way land. The lands of the Wabanaki people are recognized in a series of peace and friendship treaties to establish an ongoing relationship of peace, friendship, and mutual respect between equal nations. The river that runs by our town is known as Woolastook, along which the Woolastookee, the people of the beautiful and bountiful river. We, the staff and elected representatives, pay respect to the elders, past and present, and descendants of this land. Item 2, record of attendance. Could I have a motion, please, to excuse Kathy with cause, please?
So moved.
Second.
I'll second.
Thank you. Item 3, PAC meeting minutes of April 4th, 2022 and correspondence. Can I have a motion to accept as presented the PAC meeting minutes of April 2nd, 2022?
Chair, I just don't want to omission in record of attendance, Kathy Fawcett's name was left off in these minutes. She was at the meeting, but her name is missing from the list of attendees.
For last,
So I would move that the minutes be approved with the addition of adding Kathy Fawcett's name to the list of attendees.
okay.
Okay.
Just amend the minutes to reflect that.
Yeah.
Kathy. All righty.
I'll second that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Item 4, regular council meetings minutes of March 28, 2022 and April 11, 2022. Can I have a motion to receive and file the regular council meeting minutes of March 28 and April 11, 2022?
I'll make a motion. I'll second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Contrary minded? Motion carries. Item 5, chairman's remarks. I have no remarks this evening. Item 7 is declaration of conflict of interest. Are there any members that have a conflict of interest with tonight's agenda? Thank you. Item 7, discretionary use application, home occupation for dog grooming salon. Tony Survey, 151 Highland Road. Is there anyone present to speak on behalf of the application?
That's me.
Step up to the podium, please. State your name and your address, please.
Yes, my name is Tony Zajavic. I live at 151 Highland Road in Bay-Westfield. I'm applying to open up a home-based business, a dog grooming salon. We also groom cats too. It's going to be a small business where my wife and I work, and we're going to work about 3 days a week as our primary income. And we've identified a need in the community for grooming services. And we owned a salon in Elmer, Ontario before that too. And we are professional and experienced.
With your grooming business, do you plan to house any of these pets overnight?
No,
It's just a day.
it'll be appointment-based business. Everything's 100% appointment-based, and there are exceptions where a dog may spend an extra hour there, maybe earlier or later, or 2, right? But never overnight and never after hours, right? And this will be like a 1 dog or 2 dog at a time type of business, so there'll be dogs outside barking constantly. They'll be my dogs, by the way. And I have one neighbor, when I stand on my property to the left of me, and they have 3 dogs. I have a neighbor across the street that doesn't have any dogs, okay? But they're not directly across the street. They're kind of up the road a little bit, right? But the dogs are going to be inside, and they're not going to be outside. We don't take responsibilities for the animals outside of the facility, right? They stay inside until the owners actually come and pick them up, okay? Because they're babies, you know? And injuring an animal is not what we do. We love animals. We have 2 dogs ourselves. We just got a rescue from Texas, believe it or not. Yeah. So that's our intent.
Jared, just curious, I notice you're calling it a dog grooming business, but you're doing other animals as well.
Pardon me?
You're calling your business dog grooming, but you're doing other animals as well as dogs.
Yeah, well, I groom cats, right? We called it Fluff and Stuff Dog Grooming back in Elmer, but we changed the name to Fluff and Stuff Pet Grooming, right?
Yeah.
Because there was a demand to actually trim cats' nails, a huge demand. And some cats get matted just like dogs do. Like, do you familiar with what mats are at all in an animal? Just imagine you get a knot of hair, but you can get an animal that the actual hair will become like a pelt, where you can't actually get to the skin of the animal. And that's an extreme case where the animal has to be fully shaved, right? That does happen to cats. And a lot of people are uncomfortable working with cats. But not me, because the more you work with animals, you realize cats and dogs are more alike than you think they are. I was never a cat person until I started grooming them, actually. Yeah, they're very, very similar.
No, I'm just curious why you didn't just call it pet grooming rather than.
And we did call it pet grooming now, changed it.
Okay.
We changed the name. We do have a Facebook page, right? It's under Fluff and Stuff Pet Grooming. I'm going to be updating the website. I already have the Google location, so if you looked it up, dog groomers, cat groomers, right, will come up as on Highland Road. I did speak to David about this particulars about the signage, right? 0.55 square meters, which is 2 by 3, the standard size sign, right? 1 meter away from the property line, right? So it's going to be inobtrusive, tasteful. Everything's going to be done there. The actual garage that we're going to be putting up, right? So the back end, the back half is going to be the grooming salon, but it's the same siding, the same roofing, flashing. It's going to match the house perfectly. It's not going to be an eyesore, not one of those ramshackle buildings that some people try and put up and pass it off as being to code, but this is fully to code. I was an engineer before, so this kind of stuff is important to me.
All right, any more questions? I have to do this. Does anyone wish to speak in opposition of the application? And I need to ask this 3 times. It's the legal process of it.
Of course.
Does anyone wish to speak in opposition of the application? And finally, does anyone wish to speak in opposition of the application? If not, can I have a motion to move that the Planning Advisory Committee approve the proposal for the operation of a dog grooming salon to be located in a 12 by 12 area located at the rear of an accessory building at 151 Highland Road, PID number 303-27126, bracket as per submitted site plan, under the discretionary conditions set out in section 5.4 of the zoning bylaw number 122. That motion, please.
So move.
Second.
On the good motion that we're clarifying the different.
We're going to call it pet grooming rather than dog.
Just pet grooming is probably the most.
Sorry about that. Pets, like,
Yeah,
but there's still going to be no goats or pigs or anything like that, just like,
that you know
no, it won't happen. But dogs and cats, like animals that people have in their homes, right? No, like pythons or anything like that. I'm sorry, but our furry friends are traditional standard pet that people like to have in their homes. Just like you probably have in your homes, like dog owners, cat owners probably here too.
Alrighty, do we have a seconder?
I'll second
Andrew? Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Contrary minded? Motion carried.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet all of you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good luck with your business.
Welcome to the town.
Thank you very much.
Have a
Can
good evening.
I take this with me? This piece of paper?
Please.
Thank you.
Item number 9, draft subdivision bylaw plan, 124, presentation by Building Consulting. Jennifer Brown from Building Consulting will present to TAC the draft subdivision bylaw 124. Council has requested the written views of PAC on the proposed draft subdivision bylaw 124 as set out in the Community Planning Act, section 110(1). Jennifer, the floor is all yours.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Just need a second to set up here. I don't know whose screen this is.
And you
I'm
USB media player, maybe?
HDMI 2?
Okay.
There we go.
Great.
Okay. All set. All right. Sorry about that. So, we're gathered here this evening to do a first review of the updates to the subdivision bylaw. Just to give you a reminder, the purpose of these amendments, the purpose of the subdivision amendment is to go along with those set of amendments to the municipal plan and zoning bylaw to allow for the removal of the development charge at Colonel Nays Boulevard, initiated by council. The intention of the bylaw amendments, so in terms of process, so the subdivision bylaw doesn't require a public hearing, but it does require the views of PAC. In conversation with David, we're going to go over this your next 2 meetings. So we'll do as much as we can this evening, section by section. I'll go back, do a full update, provide you with a more finalized copy, and you get to see it all next meeting. So let's get right into it. So in terms of what you're seeing in front of you, it is very much the rough draft, the edited version. We're looking at removal of that language around Colonel Nays Boulevard in terms of infrastructure installation. However, the sections that require the developer to be responsible for infrastructure and language that suggests that all of a sudden the Council of Bay-Westfield is footing the bill for things like road installation, or future water or existing sewer or anything along those lines, that's still going to be the responsibility of the developer. Okay, so the big thing here in terms of what we were after in this set of amendments, and I call them amendments, but in actuality what you're getting is a full rewrite and repeal of what you currently have. So what you'll get versus what you've been working with, it's going to be 2 different documents, but just in general, what we're looking at here is making this a little bit easier to administer for David, for you, and for council. We're looking at classifying type 1 and type 2 subdivisions. This is pretty important. Type 1 is essentially doesn't require new roads and doesn't require may not require LPP. Your type 2 is essentially everything else. So will require new roads and public infrastructure. So type 1, we'll get into that. Type 2, we'll get into that also. But that language comes directly from the Community Planning Act. So it's not as though we're pulling this out of the air here. Your subdivision bylaw is a very technical document that mostly copies and pastes from the Community Planning Act with some sprinkles of, here's some direction on how to use this so that it becomes a little bit more user-friendly. So we want to make sure there's some improved role descriptions for PAC and also for council, and as well as the development officer. There's some need for clarity around what the intention is for the town for lands for public purpose. So whenever you create a new lot under the Community Planning Act, you are required to address lands for public purpose. That can be physical land or that can be cash in lieu. We'll get into that a little bit later on. There's also a big request to go through, and this is something that was brought up through the municipal plan and zoning bylaw process, these road specification pieces. So that's all currently found in your Schedule A of your subdivision bylaw. I won't be addressing that this evening. We need some additional time to kind of work through those technical components with the engineering folks. It is a pretty substantial undertaking, and there'll be some kind of questions that we'll work through in our next session. The other piece that we're looking to kind of address here is improved submission requirements to provide clarity around developer responsibility. I'll have some questions for you throughout this evening just to kind of understand what you're seeing versus what you want to see and what maybe we can do to set a reasonable expectation for the development community, still operating under the parameters of the Act. Okay, so we're gonna go right section to section. This is very much, I hope this to be very conversational. So if you do have questions, feel free to interrupt. I'll be taking copious amounts of notes on the document itself. And also, the hope is that if you do have commentary that we can figure out a way to get that feedback back to me, especially if you're working through the document and you notice any red flags or any particular issues. What I'm gonna likely suggest is that it be consolidated and sent through to David, and then David will send me a package of feedback that I can work through in preparation for your next meeting. So your first section, very straightforward, just your title. And then your next section is your interpretation. So yes.
I just wanted to point out that we may need to change the title if and when.
Yes. So understanding that the committee, I believe meets this week, in terms of looking at the results of the renaming, but whether, I don't think it'll be released this week.
It will be, they're meeting on Wednesday.
Right.
And we're meeting to council next Monday.
Right.
So whatever that name is, council will be then saying, this is the name, we're submitting it to the province. The province has to put it into legislation by July, and then it becomes effective in January.
Yes.
So this bylaw will still be the Bay-Westfield subdivision bylaw 124. What we do for next year is another thing.
Yeah, I will say, just on that, we're getting more and more direction from the province in terms of the expectation of updating municipalities' bylaws, the timing of that, the expectation from the town and the expectation from the province. All of that seems to be coming, trickling out now, so quite happy to hear that we're getting some direction. So January is, I hate to say it, but she's right around the corner. Summer goes fast around these places, so yes. So keeping an eye on that though, and I think what we're trying to do with any type of amendment or update is envision how this will eventually be applied to the entire entity. So we keep things pretty general, but also, you know, if there's things that need to be addressed, and we'll get to it here in the slides, but I do ask this question of private versus public road. Right now, the intention is to essentially allow subdivision off of public road only, meaning that the road has to be built to the town standards, and then that road is then vested in the town of Bay-Westfield. How we're going to do that moving forward in the future, I will be asking for your feedback. So first and foremost, under the definition section, a bit of an explanation as to why it's sitting there so sparsely, and then if I could kind of open the floor to some quick consensus. So with the subdivision bylaw, we generally apply the definitions from the zoning bylaw because you really can't have one without the other. So what we try to do is tie the zoning bylaw as much as we can to the subdivision bylaw. So right in this specific section, we're looking at adding type 1 and type 2 definitions, as well as the definition of tentative subdivision plan, because they won't be in the zoning bylaw. I wanted to ask the committee if they're okay with this kind of very defined list, or if there's a desire to have additional definitions.
It may be clear for you, but sometimes subdivisions come to you that are saying that it's a tentative final. And it's, we're just taking it through once, or whatever we need to get the council. And it's gonna be the type 2 that will most likely be the ones where we have to deal with tentative plan. And then the final plan later on. It's, we haven't used type 1 and type 2 definitions, but we've certainly dealt with it under the act as if it were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess you don't have any questions then, Jennifer?
All right, we'll keep it as is then.
Yeah.
For now. If you do have a think on it though, I will say between now and then, just let David know or me know, and we can address it appropriately.
Yeah, there's no need to complicate it a little anymore than it is.
Yeah, this is kind of what I'm thinking, because once you start adding definitions, it could be a 50-page document if you want it to be. But
we pick up those two with a fee schedule even in this bylaw, and that's coming from, again, making it consistent with the desired
Yes, okay.
incorporated areas.
So, your third section is scope. This section will probably come back to you with a bit more detail, but it's going to be very much the scope of this is applied to the parameters of the municipality, administered by town council, very much not changing the intention here, just cleaning up the language, because we want to make sure it reads like a legal document. Your fourth section is where we get into really start seeing kind of the bigger changes. So in terms of the administration, so the difference with, well, I shouldn't say the difference, but in the Community Planning Act, it's very specific that the primary administrator of the subdivision bylaw is the development officer. So in other like municipal plans and your zoning bylaw, they really reference council. In this particular section of the CPA, it's really devoted to the development officer. It allows the DO to approve subdivisions that don't require the setting out of streets, land for public purposes, or a variance without the views of PAC. So it really just depends on how, so what happens is if David receives an application, right now everything goes through PAC. It's not required that this happen, but it is up to the development officer's discretion to an extent. The other, so essentially in saying that, there is some possibility that in the future, certain responsibilities may lie with the development officer. This is particularly, I say this because if the municipality all of a sudden gets very busy and there's a lot of applications coming through the door, it is increasingly efficient to have your development officer doing those low risk, very simple, straightforward applications, getting them off the collective plate, as you will, and getting things built, rather than taking every application through
do
PAC.
that, so it's good to just spell it out, like
Yeah.
a parcel being added to another
Yes,
lot doesn't require any need
Mhm.
For public purposes or.
Right.
Or so that doesn't come to BAC or council.
Right, so an adjustment of the lines, generally just done by David. The other pieces, I'm not sure how you do this, David, but maybe you can clarify. If the subdivision, the tentative approval has expired, that's also taken care of by David. So it's just clarifying what David can and can't do essentially without your views. So the big thing we're here to talk about is the role of the Planning Advisory Committee. So the PAC is really the secondary administrator of this bylaw, and that's provided for by the Community Planning Act. The fun piece, though, is that the CPA says that a subdivision bylaw may outline these roles for you. And in this bylaw, the may is going to describe what we're going to do. So we're not taking any of these off of the plate. These are really whatever the CPA says you may do, we're putting that on you folks, which is entirely what you already do. It's just defining that in the bylaw. So what that looks like is approving an access other than a street, which makes no sense, but what that means though often is a private street or flag lot style development is required to come through something like PAC. We hope not to get a lot of those. Providing your views on a proposed subdivision application, we're going to keep that as is. You approve names of streets, you consent to the sale of lands for public purpose, which I think honestly in the province of New Brunswick is going to become an increasingly popular application that's going to come through the PACs. And you approve variances to the subdivision bylaw and apply terms and conditions to that variance. So it really puts council in kind of a tertiary role. They send to LPP and they essentially approve your approvals. Any questions on roles? Excuse me. I really thought there would be more conversation around the role. Only because, I just want to make sure that folks we've gone through kind of that onboarding section where we talked about your role and expectation. This is just very much a result of that. There should be no surprises here, but if there are any kind of questions.
What do you mean by consent to the sale of land for public purpose?
So council has the official say, but they require you to say, we're comfortable with letting this go for market value, which is required by the Act. The other piece is there could be extenuating circumstances on that piece of land that they need your views on. So it's very much the same type of analysis and review that you would provide to any other amendment or anything like that.
And
A
David,
good example would be Rockwood Park, where the city was planning to do development and take parts of the park, and PAC was in opposition to council's desire.
Yeah. So if there's town-owned land that became town-owned through the lands for public purpose dedication, and there was an offer, or perhaps the CAO or council decided we don't need all of this land, which is very likely that you don't need all of this land. In order to sell it, they need to come through you.
okay.
Yeah. So it's just a bit of a kind of safety lever to make sure that you're not letting go of something that's actually contributing to the community. It's unlikely that those are the parcels of land that a town would want to let go of,
Right.
but because of the way that LPP provisions were written in the Act before 2017, we're seeing a lot of like shorelines, rivers, tiny pizza pie slices way out in the middle of nowhere that can't contribute to any type of community enjoyment. So there is a movement to kind of offload those. Some of them are being poised for especially riverbanks, they could go back to something like Crown Land. There's processes involved in all of that, and then to understand that you're part of that process.
Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? Very straightforward. I really hope that this community starts seeing some of those LPP things, because what you're looking at is opportunity a lot of the time. So especially on the fringes of subdivisions that may be built out, there could be opportunity that lies there.
David, do we have any examples? That's where I was like,
Of land for public
that we
purpose.
sold, that Grand Bay-Westfield had
There
this.
is one that we sold on, Club Drive.
No way. On Country Road?
It resulted in 3 homes being built.
So obviously at the top.
The first part was to gain access in behind, it had like 200 acres, and the only way to get to it was through the public purpose lot. And then the way they finished the street, it was a block at the end of the street, but the street was meant to go straight through.
Like
So
on
there was
this.
a lot of trading.
Yeah.
Put together, but that one definitely was.
Good example, thank you.
On your street.
You're familiar with your,
Oh, man.
I know, okay, I don't even have to visualize, I know what he's talking about.
Okay, so we're comfortable with the administration piece. I'm gonna go into, I'm going backwards here. First up, oh, goodness gracious me. Second here.
We have a late arrival coming, Kathy.
Okay, so next section is on applications, so that's your section 5. Okay, so under the requirements, I think this is where, so far this evening, you've been reluctant to provide feedback. Your exception, thank you. I really need to pull out some information here from you folks on what you're seeing in these applications and what could be helpful to move you through these applications perhaps a little bit easier. So what do you want to see? Because I know some of the applications, so the quality of your applications is improving. That's easy to see. We're getting better quality applications. We're not talking about sketches on paper anymore. These are professionally prepared applications. That's a very good step in the right direction. I'm wondering if that's enough, or are we looking at, I guess what I'm trying to pull out are, what are the struggles?
the biggest thing is, we don't wanna make it too complicated.
Mhm.
Because we could turn around and say we want a GPS, map done,
Mhm.
you know, and then it takes the home, or the developer, or the homeowner, you know, increase more costs,
Right.
you know. And I believe the city of St. John does that now, but
Well, so what the city asks for, it depends on the type of subdivision. And then the complexity of what's being proposed in terms of the development, which is very similar to what I would recommend here, but obviously the complexity, when you have water and sewer and you need to determine if a water study is needed, a flow study or a flow analysis is required, that's probably more intensive than maybe required here, but it does depend on the development. So in terms of the visuals, so I know, for example, when an application comes through, there's a lot of talk about not what the subdivision, as in the lines on the map. There's a lot of discussion about what's coming in the future.
like we did with the gentleman in Westfield at the time with the 200 lots, and then with the wet zones that he had. And then we have also our protection with water quality, and, you know, a lot of that.
Yeah.
we haven't been fortunate enough yet to go anything bigger than like a 5 to 10.
Right. Well, there's still,
Panoramic Estates is a good example, as it was brought down the hill to meet the infrastructure on Williston. That had to be determined that it wasn't gonna overcharge the system simply by that Williston. And looking at the contours of the lane, at what point does that development no longer feed down to Williston? It'll start going off in a different direction.
so some of these requirements are going to be difficult to spell out in this section. I think about the Shannon Road application as kind of of a big kind of, it was a challenging application because.
Good word.
It was a challenging application because there's a lot of history attached to it, obviously, and that's going to continue to happen. But what I'm looking for here is, how can we get more information in your hands to make a decision? I will say, some of this information doesn't have to necessarily come from the applicant. Some of it can come from David. And so trying to find that balance, it also doesn't necessarily need to live in your bylaw. It could be something that is, the wish list. So some wish list items, say you come through with a big old subdivision development that's like 100 lots off an existing subdivision, and then everybody in the subdivision is very concerned about the big T word, traffic. So, would it be reasonable to ask the applicant to provide a traffic impact statement? Probably, but do we need to list it in the subdivision bylaw? That's what I'm trying to suss out here. So it isn't going to be a shall require. It could be a list of may require. So stormwater management is another big one. Shannon Road is a great example of that. So Shannon Road, for example, when you're looking at subdivisions, stormwater becomes increasingly difficult because you can ask for some sort of stormwater management guarantee through a developer agreement. But often when you see larger subdivisions come through, they're not doing anything to the land. They're literally drawing lines on a piece of paper and registering it with the province. So they can't impact, really, their actions aren't going to impact stormwater management. But whoever goes through for development permits are going to be responsible for stormwater management. The challenge becomes, how do we, through the larger subdivision applications, start that ball rolling? Because we're seeing why we're seeing things happen in Shannon Road, for example, areas, because the larger subdivision the stormwater management plan wasn't planned for the larger area, it was planned lot by lot. And so right now we can say through our Schedule A standards, no increase in runoff, as in no net runoff from the site, so everything has to be contained. That'll do to an extent, but what do we ask for from the applicant at that first kick at the can when they're just slicing up their land?
No net increase.
No net increase, yes, but also option for no net runoff.
The question that I wanted to ask is, should we ask them if they think that there's any potential impact to their neighbor?
So that's part of your purview. So in the Act, to an extent. So in the Act, it talks about you reviewing a subdivision under the pretense that it will not impact future development of the area. So you are expected to not approve, and David is too, not approve a subdivision that would prejudice development in another area. That's the standard of your review. In terms of impact to neighbors, it becomes challenging because you don't necessarily know the scale and scope of the development that's coming through a subdivision application, unless they provide you, which is becoming increasingly less it's much less popular than it used to be. Developers aren't building houses on spec any longer. They're creating your subdivision and then individually selling the lots. I go out and I buy an individual lot and I build the house that I want to build, and therefore I'm now responsible for ensuring that the impacts of my development there are no impacts of my development on my neighbors. So there's some reasonable questions there. I think that goes back to, that's what you lean on David for, is an explanation of, at full build out, considering the max, what's allowed under the zoning provisions, what could the anticipated impacts be? So for example, in an R2 zone, I think you can have up to a maximum of 6 townhouses on a single lot. So if you do a 3-lot subdivision and they're planning to put 6 units on each, you've got 18 units. That's the max you can get. Let's think about the application in that respect. So that's max 18 units. Then we can talk about what could be the implications. But it's a very slippery slope, and that's why it comes to you, and it's not up to David to make that decision.
Right, but sometimes when you get an applicant to think about that prior to submitting their application, it could be a benefit to PAC if we ever had to turn down an application. Because if I'm gonna sell subdivision and I'm worried about cutting down all the trees because it's a hill, what happens to the people that bought in front of me?
Right. Yeah, no, I absolutely understand. I think the thing to remember is that you can't ask new developers to pay for the sins of past developers. That's not, it's just not the way that things work. However, you have improved standards that when I say new developers, I mean anybody coming through the door to build something new or expand on something existing. Though they are expected to adhere to the existing parameters that you have in place today, which are much more stringent and much more progressive than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So it is difficult to say to a developer who's standing here saying, I want a 10-lot subdivision, it's zoned R2, it's difficult to say to them, well, what are the impacts going to be on your neighbors? We don't know, because we don't know what's actually going to be built there. What we do is improve things like your Schedule A to ensure that they're beholden to some sort of standard that is built in theory to limit the impacts on surrounding properties.
For the requirements, one thing that I truly thought was beneficial on the 2 that we did, 2 official site visits, was a site visit. Like, I get a lot out of that. Like, I drove by Tony's house, the pet grooming business. I drove by his house and I'm looking at the diagram of his property, but I do feel like that should be, maybe it is a may require.
Well,
We may require a site visit.
that's you doing that though. That's not the applicant saying, I'm gonna go visit my site. That's you
No,
as
no.
PAC.
But, like, do we have to acknowledge that we may require a site visit? Is it okay if the PAC comes for a site visit on your property? Yes or no?
So you're legally permitted to do a site visit, because you're acting on behalf of the town. So the town is able to visit your property on business of the town. I would assume that extends to PAC. So obviously a site visit, you're not expected to go and be destructive in any way.
No.
But observing kind of the development pattern and also maybe the parameters of the site is perfectly reasonable. And I will say that's a baseline expectation of PAC in other communities. So they're in their procedures, as in their PAC bylaw, there is usually something written in that says,
And usually it's us driving by and
yes.
peeking and trying to see in the backyard.
Well, I mean, when David does his site visits, and I can speak as a former development officer who used to do those site visits, when the weather's bad, I'm taking pictures from my car. Absolutely. I'm not trouncing out there in the cold. But yeah, I think what we're trying to get after here is what you require from an applicant. So in terms of a site visit, that would be a responsibility laid on you.
Right.
Yeah.
So we just have to be more vocal saying we wanna.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
But there is some guidelines there presently to help protect the town and the landowners that are already there, homeowners.
Mhm.
But we need to do a little bit more, because I know in my area, they're looking at selling 50 to 60 lots
Mhm.
on a hill. Water's gonna come down, mud's gonna come down,
Yeah.
you know.
So in saying that, I think that's what we're trying to get at here is this, so there's different scales of stormwater management planning. So if you went in, for example, and were wanting to build a single detached dwelling, what's generally required is that you provide essentially an arrow drawing showing where the flow of water is going. And then some sort of estimate of the amount of water that comes off of that site pre-development, as in if it's a vacant lot, and then what is anticipated post-development. That's a very easy calculation for a surveyor or an engineer to provide you. It is commonly provided in your basic application. As you ramp that up into multiple units, I think it's this ask to the developer to say, at least provide you a pre-development number of what the runoff is currently sitting at. That is something I think that they can easily provide you. In terms of the expected post-development runoff, it becomes a bit more complex because again, a lot of these folks are coming through with no plans beyond cutting those lots up. So we would have to use some sort of a formula that's based on what the max, as in like the highest use of the land could be, which is again a calculation that they could do.
I think the two things though that you have mentioned about that, so traffic flow and runoff,
Mhm.
those were big issues there.
Yeah.
And I do feel like if I think about the requirements for us, like we had a lot of controversy as far as the letters that we were receiving,
Mhm.
you know, against the applicant.
Mhm.
So I do think in some circumstances, maybe it's not an actual requirement, but may require.
Yeah. I think that's reasonable. What I can do is, I think stormwater management is the one we hear about often here in Bay-Westfield. Traffic, I think, is more of a nuanced conversation. There's also a difference between a traffic impact statement and a traffic impact study. A study is much more comprehensive. With comprehensive, that word also means expensive. So there is sometimes negotiation between who's going to pay for that. That is, a more nuanced conversation, but stormwater is a little bit easier to calculate. Traffic impact, again, if we leave it at may require, this is something that David can work through with the applicant.
The Millennium apartment buildings, we made it clear that we wanted a study done for their driveway access close to the intersection. We ended up paying for it, but we wanted to make sure that it was gonna be workable. Yeah. And I'll just, well, I've got you, the application form itself does read all the things that the applicants are required to do, and BAC is required to do, and I'm supposed to be required to do, but they are signing on their application, it says by completing and signing this form, the applicant grants permission to town inspectors to enter the land, building premises or at any reasonable time for the purpose of conduction inspections associated with the review of the application. And you are in that.
Are we inspectors?
We're inspectors now.
Yeah.
You're inspecting the property to make a decision.
Oh, that's not a defined term, who a town inspector is?
The building inspector is a defined person.
But not town inspector.
Wait till they give you a bylaw officer.
Anything else on requirements?
Just a question, clarification, both for yourself and maybe David, I don't know who can best answer. Stormwater management is becoming a major issue with climate change and everything. Included in stormwater management, I'm assuming, here's my question, I corrected my assumption, that it could be a combination of piping and also open ditch
Mhm.
And open ditches may have to lead into maybe a pond or a holding pond or something. It doesn't have to be one or the other, it can be a combination of all two or three.
Yeah, so ideally, it would be a combination. Because one is usually not, depending on the scale of development, obviously, one system isn't usually enough to combat the scale of water that we're starting to see with our rainfall numbers increasing because of climate change, or as a result of climate change. So we understand that ditching is primarily what's happening in subdivisions now. If in the future there is increased investment in stormwater management, we could require something like retention ponds for this. Retention ponds are very popular in multi-unit development, but multi-units where there's more than one multi-unit on a site, there generally is some sort of necessity for a stormwater management pond with the accompaniment of something like pipe stormwater management or ditching. So a combination is ideally. But it can be, by definition, anything. Any of those, as long as it meets that criteria of stormwater management. So we usually refer to them as a system because a system assumes that there's more than one component.
Thank you. I'm just a little concerned that if we ever had a situation where it had to be 100% stormwater pipes,
Yeah.
it would make me wonder how
Where'd they go?
how the water recharges in our wells.
Yeah.
If all the water and rainwater is directed into pipes and go down to a river or somewhere.
Yeah, even so, the water will still have time to percolate because it depends on the amount of water that falls. If it's not enough to move itself into a catchment, then it's going to percolate. Even when it's fast flowing, there's still a level of percolation. In these kind of, as we see more development on kind of those upland areas, which is what I think the community is most concerned about, we need to look at more than just ditching because ditching's currently not working. There needs to be additional accommodation. Could be through retention pond, but it could be through retention pond that's developed in concert with the municipality if there's enough development pressure. But it's this balancing act between getting the development and then making sure that your existing residents are satisfied. But we can do that through improved regulation in that Schedule A that's coming in your bylaw. Yeah, stormwater is difficult. Regardless, even in a flat area, it's difficult.
And I would assume that straight open ditches is the least expensive route for a developer.
It is the least expensive route for the developer, but it's also the least expensive to maintain because in theory, that's going to eventually be the responsibility of the municipality. So you can clear out ditches. You can ensure that they're cleared regularly. You can also change the size of culverts that move through that system, but that's eventually going to be on the municipality's dime. So it's taking the time. Now we're being forced into a situation, everyone, where we have to look at stormwater management big picture, where we used to be able to really focus on lot by lot. So it's a combination of both. And the approach will be to evolve.
The benefit of the ditch collection of water coming off the properties is one side of the equation. The street infrastructure on the open ditch on Hill particularly has been the problem because at that rate of flowing water,
Degrades the road.
it erodes streets and they have had a lot of lessons learned.
Thank you.
Any other feedback on requirements? I will add that stormwater piece, and if I think what we can do is better connect between what's in Schedule A in terms of those parameters and also what you have in terms of municipal standards in general. So you'll have a general spec that if a developer comes through and wants to build a road, stormwater management is built right in. I think that we just need to do a better job of connecting to those different documents, which I can do here under the requirements.
I have a note for you to take to the Schedule A. The previous version of the bylaw has, they don't have pointed corners. They've got marked points at the intersections with the 45-degree angle on it. It's a good idea in itself, but it becomes really difficult when property owners are trying to deal with where the property is. And that's not what's been happening anyways.
Okay,
It's not something that I've said I'm tearing this up because we didn't do it the way the spec shows it. It doesn't seem to me to be the typical way of doing it, so.
okay, that makes sense to
I
me.
don't know how to particularly.
Okay, so the next kind of feedback portion we're looking at is your fees. Any comments on fees or any potential flags there? Are fees a discussion that is coming out in the community or through, is anybody raising a flag around fees?
Now, our fees are in line with most,
Yes. Yeah. If not, they're actually a little bit lower, to be honest.
well,
And they've been traditionally very low, $100 application.
Yeah.
It has come up and this two-tiered application fee is in line with the provincial rate that they've had since before 2010.
This is what the provincial rate is, the 200 to 500? Does that increase or, is it indexed in some way so that it increases over time, or would you have to change the model?
Might change at some point, but the increments come in the lots. So like take one is a $200 fee, which is our fee, and if you're just creating one lot, it would be $225.
Yeah.
At the moment, $200. If you were creating 5, and we've had a couple that size, it would be the 200 plus.
so it's pretty cheap, really.
The type 2 has a higher rate starting at $500 plus $550 for each lot, but that is where there's a lot more effort trying to work out the details of the stormwater management and the sanitaries. So,
I was just curious of the rationale for refunding abandoned applications versus not for what's on it.
I don't know where that one came from.
What's that, the refunding what?
If you abandon an application, get your
Get your money back?
you get your money back, but if you withdraw it, you don't get your money back.
So that's,
At the time.
that is, so generally, what I was attempting to be a bit more friendly there. What we usually do, especially, so under B where it says, the development officer shall issue a refund for an abandoned application, it's generally 50% up to 80%. They never generally get the 100% back. That's very much up to you folks. So I think the idea of an abandoned application, them getting the refund, where I was coming from there is that perhaps this notification that, hey, you've abandoned your application may trigger them into action rather than, hey, I'm only giving you $50 or $100 of your $200 back. It was a idea to do a bit of a push and a pull rather than just say, you know, yeah. But I don't know how many abandoned applications you're actually gonna get. David, do you have a lot of?
Not a lot, although the one that we just did on Highland Road for 5 subdivision has 5 subdivision lots, was brought forward with 7 lots in 2004 and he never did it, so that's got back again, that's a new thing.
I guess the idea, the way I'm seeing it is, if it's abandoned, the assumption is no work has really been started, So if it's abandoned, that means that it's not come to PAC, there's not an approval, so there's no work to pay for. The idea that if you withdraw it, we've started that work, that's where the rationale is coming from. Whether or not it's sound rationale, I'm not sure. The idea is to be, I guess I was attempting to be a bit gentler than I would normally be.
Because those more expensive, difficult ones, we do get the engineers involved very early on to help the process move along.
Yeah.
I think the money's been spent by 90 days after it's been filed, like I don't see the rationale for a refund. I think that then you've just caused the town to do work for no benefit to the town.
Can I ask you, David, do you see that a lot in terms of sort of dipping a toe in the water to see how it's gonna go, or in terms of the payment?
The Highland Road, they didn't get but they didn't get a refund back.
Okay. So do you want me to change it to no refund regardless? If you're abandoned, no refund?
That's kind of my
Yeah,
take.
okay.
Yeah,
So I'll
our
change
money
it.
spent.
Well, it puts an onus of, you know,
Some
on the
diligence.
developer that, you know, if you're gonna do this, you're gonna do it.
Yeah,
Take
yeah.
it seriously.
And I mean, to Kathy's point also, like, quite literally, the money has very much been spent. Unless you're talking about an enormous subdivision, I mean, the money has absolutely been spent. So I think that's fair. I'll change that to essentially just say abandoned or withdrawal applications don't receive a refund. But I'll keep the part that explains that it's considered abandoned after 90 days. 90 days is prescribed, I think, by the Community Planning Act. So in general, we're okay there with these. We'll update the abandoned piece. So the next section, if everyone's okay, we'll go to section 6, responsibilities of the subdivider. A lot of this language is coming right out of the Community Planning Act, not a whole lot to say here. So you'll notice that our engineer and David made some comments here. Even the material, in terms of the sizes, even that's prescribed by the Act. Which I've never seen in any other province, but here we are. It usually is, so the 1 in 500, 1 in 2,000 is pretty common, or 1 in 5,000. But the sheet size is generally just, is accommodated by the standard engineering size sheets, which I'm not entirely sure if these line up anymore, but it's fine. The folks that are applying are complaining about it, so I don't imagine it's an actual big issue. The only other question here was about the posted speed signs. Not sure if there's any feedback there. On that page, no? Yeah.
It is in the act, but if you made it to say one of the following relative sizes, it's really based on saying the different scale of drawings need to be appropriate.
Yeah. And I would hope that a lot of this is being submitted online, but I don't know. Are they mostly being submitted online, drawings?
They all will be, I can get paper, tape.
Okay.
I'll get a digital PDF of it, and then once they're all, I think they just sign the originals, but then he makes a PDF to register it.
Oh, okay.
Just more paper laying around, isn't it, David? If you go to the A size all the time.
Yeah, but it's the larger scale paper for the scale of the drawing.
Yeah.
And it's just not waste paper either.
I think the speed sign stuff is in the schedule a lot of this.
I
But those,
I think they're in the
those
spec, not
sizes are in the act, and that's why
Yes,
the
exactly.
question came up.
Yeah. The speed sign piece though, I think those come through in the engineering spec for new roads. So I know that it's sitting in the act and that's likely why it's here. So even if it were gone, it would still be caught in the spec. But here perhaps it's a bit more user friendly, not sure. The other question I wanted to ask just in this section was around, so you see this section around the flow arrows, contours, and elevations, required to indicate lot elevation. Is there a necessity here to go back to your flood overlay zone to point back to your minimum elevation, for habitable space? So you have your 6.4 meter minimum elevation now. Do we wanna quote the number, or do you wanna just refer to the section in the zoning bylaw? So my worry about, and David, I don't know, you may have comment on this. My concern about connecting it to a number is that the number may change. We've also written the zoning bylaw so that if the number does change, that's okay, it can continue, the zoning bylaw can continue to provide low risk development in those areas. I'm just wondering what the best approach is for this lot elevation piece in the subdivision bylaw, if it's as simple as just connecting it to that zone.
I like the overlay, but overlay zone is the preference.
Okay, so just point to the zone itself. Is everybody okay with that?
Keeps us out of trouble sometimes.
Okay, so I don't have anything other big questions for that section 6. Does anybody else?
The proposed name of the subdivision, now, does that go to the developer? Or do we have a name bank like we do for our streets?
I don't,
The approval is to the BAC. The developer has the right to propose it,
Okay,
and we do have a name bank as well.
okay. But it comes through PAC, then all that.
I believe PAC in terms of street and name approval, I think it stops here. I think you're the approver. Yeah. And then if it goes to council, it's just for an FYI.
And we don't wanna have things that are too similar to another name, awkward names. Hopefully we can get it so that it's not even presented as a no option, but
For some reason.
you're still in 6.
Yeah, I'm trying to change my slides and they're changing on my screen, but not on this big screen. Bear with me here.
We could have a conversation about tree
Oh, tree planting.
planting.
Yeah, that's what I'm ready for.
Tree planting is currently,
Section 3L.
yeah, so there's a couple things at play here. So the landscaping requirements do lay within, like, they're currently prescribed in your zoning bylaw. But again, it does depend on the zone, of course, and it depends on the type of development. So if there's a multi-unit, for example, there may be a requirement for a percentage of amenity space. So that may not be able to be calculated, but if there is plans for something like a tree buffer or something like that, I think that's where the act is getting at. So this idea of conserving the trees that are already there or providing for some sort of indication of where they're going to be. Because the act specifically talks about planting, not necessarily cutting down. But is there a desire to expand upon that?
issue I see is in, for promoting tree planting, street trees. In some places there are requirements
Yeah.
to provide street.
So I work with a couple towns that have in their zoning bylaw for every, like, this many units, you have to, if there's a front yard that's created, you've gotta put this type of tree in, it's gotta be from this type of, like, they list out, the types of trees. What that has in the past generated for them is variance applications through PAC. I think what would be a good plan is to look at the landscaping requirements in the zoning bylaw to see what they cover out. If you're talking about trees in relationship to streets, we should probably include them in the spec. And or at least in Schedule A.
Because a street tree could be under the subdivision bylaw requirement of the developer of the street.
Yeah.
Unlike the homeowner developing the lot.
Right. But in saying that though, there could be, so I guess where I see the wrinkle in that is a developer comes through and applies for a 20 lot subdivision. PAC puts on that standard that there is a requirement that 1 tree per lot be planted at the completion of, or at the issuance of an occupancy permit, something along those lines. Do you see any issue with that conflicting with what's in the zoning bylaw? Or I guess what I'm really asking is, do we rely upon PAC to come up with that each time on their own? Or do we write it right into the
I think it
spec?
would need to have a direction in it, and it would be under the developer's agreement
Okay.
in the end.
Because I think, so with that, I think when it comes to the developer's agreement, there may be an instance where if they're planning to do some sort of entrance to their subdivision, that you can talk about parameters for the neighborhood sign, landscaping around the sign, something along those lines.
That is been asked, but we don't look at it in the bylaw.
Okay. Okay, we're moving on to the next section. Continues on the conversation we're having really around streets. So right now, under section 7, and I understand that this is like we're asking you to weigh in on technical requirements, but this is exactly what will happen if an application comes through. So right now, in terms of your maximum cul-de-sac, so I have it prescribed here as 200 meters, but there is provision to allow for an extension of 300 meters right now if there are pedestrian connections through. So if you have a development that has an extensive amount of like cul-de-sacs or something like that, you can max out at 300 meters if you're providing connection to the multiple cul-de-sacs that exist in the area. 200 meters is pretty standard. 300 you're pushing it only because if there's no other access in or out, 200 meters it's long. But it is necessary in some respects to use the developable footprint of a lot of these lots that you're going to see developed in the next 10, 20 years.
The default size on cul-de-sacs, I think were quite large.
Okay.
In existing Schedule A. We had to deal with a lot of earlier ones that have pre-existing smaller homes, but it seemed to me that it could be looked at, or if it's kept at that size, having a green space in the center.
The other question I have around that cul-de-sac question is you're going to see phase 1 is 100 meters. And they'll ask for an exemption from the bulb requirement because phase 2 extends the street. So there likely needs to be some sort of parameter around temporary turnaround. And what constitutes temporary, is there a time frame of comfort there? David, I'm not sure how you deal with that temporary turnaround now.
We do, I'm just not sure how it's spelled it out.
Okay, yeah. So again, we may be dealing with this now, but it may not ever be an issue, you know, this standard of a temporary turnaround. But there is some necessity for the word temporary to go away at some point. And so what we've asked generally, and I think we'll come to this in another section of part 7, but this idea of the developer is required to deposit 100% of the cost to install the street as part of the development agreement. And so in saying that, if the street only extends 100 meters and phase 2 never happens, when do those phase 1 folks get that proper bulb turnaround? And it's likely going to be at the expense of the municipality because the developer really is likely long gone at this point. But in theory, there should be funds deposited to allow for the payment of that bulb. So I'm wondering if it's worth the discussion to have that temporariness defined in the spec, or is that a case-by-case consideration?
We've had one where the tentative bulb was created in the subdivision, which, as it extended later on, really complicated the reformation of the lots as the next stage.
Mhm.
Most of the ones that we've had are shown on the developer's lot and temporary turnaround. It's not within the subdivision. So yes, if he just walks away from the whole thing, we either leave it at that or, well, actually, because it's on the plan, it should enable that to always be maintained that way. So
Yeah, yeah,
as long as it's on the plan shown as a temporary, you can eliminate it without
right.
creating the street or.
Yeah, 'cause I guess I'm thinking about the situation where, I think you have it in a couple instances, where folks come in and say, well, I don't wanna, so I'm interested in, but I don't wanna develop the lot that's immediately next to the temporary turnaround. I wanna do the third lot in, and I want the town to pay for the road to be extended. So that's what I'm trying to avoid, is that that incremental development is fine, but this requirement to extend the public road at the expense of the developer, that needs to continue, and how do we ensure that continues through phase 2, phase 3, phase 4? There's likely no silver bullet solution, but there could be some sort of language discussing it at least, perhaps, I'm not sure. We're trying to, the intention here is to remove as much burden on the municipality as possible.
Yep.
Without it being perceived as a barrier to development. A lot of that is about perception, not reality, unfortunately. But you've made such strides as a community to become increasingly developer friendly. You're seeing that through your improved applications that you're getting to come through the door. The quality of the applications are improving, so I think you're on the right track, but it's just a matter of laying down those kind of extra direction that would suggest that, hey, developer, don't try us, kind of thing, in the background.
Well, if they do have phase 1, and so then they don't have to put the bulb in because there's a potential for phase 2 requiring the road to go all the way through. So that's them asking for relief from the requirements because they're going to have phase two? Is there no deposit they can pay towards the cost of that, so that if they do walk away and somebody else wants to develop it, we've got to extend the road? Can that not be built into the developer agreement in some way?
What is in there now is the cost to develop all of the road fronting on all the new lots
regardless of phase,
for that current phase.
for that current phase. Again, so it would be extreme to ask them to deposit if they're looking at 5 phases of development. We can't ask them to deposit all 5 phases of the public road, but there could potentially be an insurance of some sort to allow for moving that forward. I guess what I'm thinking is kind of bridging that gap.
Yeah, I'm only thinking of, if you're looking for an exemption from the requirement for the turnaround, right? Not for all the streets that are gonna be in phase 3, 4, 5, but in respect to phase 1, if that is eventually said, please don't make us put in this turnaround because this is gonna be a full road in phase 2, well, now you're asking for an exemption to the standards, and so you're gonna have to ensure that in some way. Not for all the other phases, because they haven't asked for an exemption for anything yet. I think when they ask for an exemption from our standards, they should expect to pay something.
So what they currently do, I was just looking for a whiteboard because I was about to write this down. So what they currently do is they'll subdivide, I'm gonna label it very technically here. So what they do now is they'll say, okay, I've got a 6-lot subdivision. Here's my new street. This is your old lot, and this is where they provide the turnaround. So what we're running into is when somebody wants to do this. So this is not currently to municipal standard. And the debate is who carries the road from here to here. Because the rules would suggest it's this person, but it is asking a lot for somebody to put in. It's expensive to build a road that's at least 20 meters wide. We're not even accounting for roads that may have extra stormwater management requirements or something along those lines, sidewalks. We're requiring them to accommodate for this person's future development. This person's future development,
And that's what was created in 2004 in subdivision bylaw to provide that the developer needed to carry the cost to that second lot or third lot, however far out the road that he wanted to create his lot. But the per meter charge would then be determined
right.
for anyone coming in afterwards to take advantage of the development.
So I think what's happening, so I'm trying to avoid this, but I don't think there really is we can avoid this. This linear charge is still not a perfect solution because this person who wants to develop their individual lot is now beholden to the town for a developer agreement for building one house. So this is what I'm trying to avoid when I say, how long do we wait for that temporary turnaround? Because if there is some sort of insurance that says we can pay this, then it meets the developer halfway for those who want to develop back here.
But even the first house, even the second, would have to be the developer extending.
So that's what we're trying, that's the question I'm asking. I'm asking if there's a way that you're seeing maybe in the back of your brain to avoid this happening, but there may not be. It may just be
Well, I would like to see something, because what we had from 2004, what the rules would allow us, it captured that amount but left us with the weird language that we had on Colonel Mace as well.
Yeah.
Any new vacant lot created on the road would have to pay its share. But just because you owned that lot and didn't create a subdivision, then you would get the benefit of having paid for it already.
Yeah.
That was always the bad part of that scenario, so.
There is something in the act that talks about, I mean, that's how we implemented the Colonel Mays development charge. So there is allowances for it, but why I'm hesitating is that council has gone through this process to remove a development charge, and we're sitting here saying, maybe not all development, like it feels like you're putting it right back in. But I mean, it's not apples for apples, like it's absolutely something that the town will continue to get stuck with, because you've got roads that I think were planned for future development that are sitting there just waiting for something to happen, so it's just a matter of time before that does come through. But I do think it's in the act that talks about the linear footage. But I do remember, David, that section you're speaking of in your last bylaw, so I'll pull that up.
So, but it's different because the act is different.
Yeah.
The act now has in section 92, development charge agreements.
Yeah.
And might be more clear than what we had.
Okay, I'll look into that and make sure I have some sort of clarity for next section. Okay.
So, but what leads to the perception that we are less than developmentally friendly? Like, are our charges out of line with what is charged in other municipalities, or where does that come from?
So, my opinion on it, it's very much not based in, this is just observation. And this is consistent with what I'm observing in all towns across Atlantic Canada that I work with. You have a defined development community who has worked here for a very long time, and new costs are coming up that perhaps they weren't always required to cover. They're perceiving those costs as the town's fault, as in the town is making me pay this. But in reality, it's just that the town is no longer footing the bill for certain things that they may have once. This is very common in St. John, for example. It's common throughout the province. So a developer who developed in the 90s still think, not all of them obviously, but it is very common to have a conversation where they'll say, I didn't pay for that when I developed that subdivision, but that subdivision is now 30 years old, and the standards have changed, the fiscal responsibilities have changed, and the pockets are not as deep as they once were, and we're not getting the same grant funding for that type of cost from the provincial and federal government that we were in the 90s. So I do think it's a bit of, we're a small development community in New Brunswick. A lot of folks have been developing for generations, and so it's very much a historic perspective.
So there's nothing really that sets our town out differently from any of the other
In terms of
comparable
cost for development,
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think the biggest challenge, and it's a hard pill to swallow, is services. So you don't cost as much to develop, but then you're not providing as much either, because you don't have pipe water. And a lot of the neighborhoods don't have pipes of sanitary sewer or storm sewer. So, I mean, that's the cost of living in a kind of rural footprint, which is why people move here. So it is, you can't say, you can't say that's a big problem when you purposely moved here for these things. And that's offset by the fact that you don't pay nearly the cost for land or for development.
Raw land is generally lower, but we do have more considered rock than dealing with hills. So those are two expense factors.
In reality, having our own wells and having the septic system is far cheaper than the water tax and the tax base that St. John
Yeah.
gets at,
I think the other thing to speak to that a bit is that as we shift from development trend to development trend, and the trend right now is multi-units, and that's not going to go away. It's the demand is needed because the demographics of the population is shifting. But what's required often enough are for something like a communal well and communal septic is much more robust environmental impact assessment. Obviously in the province, you're in a municipality, so that responsibility is pushed onto the community, but it's likely because you're looking at a communal well, we have to ask the province what the standard is, and it's likely that if someone came through with an application for a very large communal well, very large communal septic, it would have to go through some sort of impact assessment. And that cost is borne by the developer, which, you know,
It's expensive.
it's expensive, and it also takes time. So the time thing is a big factor in development as well. The benefit to you here is that you get through your permitting so quickly. Folks come through, even for a rezoning or a subdivision application, we're talking months, weeks. Where other communities, it could be 6 months. If you live in a rural area under a rural plan, it's a full year before you can get a rezoning. So, I mean, there is benefit to developers coming into a community like Bay-Westfield. Okay. I know it's late. I would like to just cover this land for public purposes piece, and then we'll leave the rest for next month. The lands for public purposes piece, what I need feedback on is whether or not in the bylaw itself, you speak to the preference being to the cash in lieu of lands for public purpose. So should you feel that there is perhaps a situation where lands for public purpose would be preferred, then I think there's always opportunity for you to look at that depending on the context. But right now, when you've got applications coming through, I guess what I'm wondering is, do you even have folks looking to do actual lands, or is it all cash in lieu?
The direction is to do land, or cash.
Cash in lieu, okay.
To avoid having these little pieces. And the smaller slivers come from the fact that small subdivision plans of 1 or 2 or 3 lots has always been more economical for the developer not to overextend himself and have these lots on their books for years. So although we try to with our incentive program give a little bit more push to have those larger lot subdivisions created, there may be points where we could look at land instead of money in lieu.
Okay.
Particularly if it's something that we're looking at the downhill rate of our storm sewer, and we need to have some area to recharge it before it goes into specific growth. But it would be good to at least frame it for what we are doing.
Yeah.
Frame it in that we look for the money in lieu option first. Because it's always left as a question, okay, if you're at the PAC, we're gonna suggest the council consider it.
Okay.
And then they take it to council and they say, okay, thank you very much. But
Okay.
if it's not so much a question,
Yeah.
it's the same.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that the cash, it doesn't go into the regular coffers of the community. It goes into a specific fund to be used for community amenity, so recreation amenity specifically. The only other question I have on that, and this is just a large one, so if you want to take it home with you, that's fine. So it's 8% of market value. The market is interesting right now, to say the least. And I'm not, maybe David, this is a question for you. How are you currently determining market value? Because the act just says market value, doesn't prescribe a way to determine.
It is so widely disjointed across the province.
Yes.
But reading the act saying that the value of the land is the current value of the land before subdivision,
Okay.
you can't say, well, you're gonna create a lot that's gonna be worth 50,000.
Yeah.
That's not what the act says, and I know there are municipalities that do it that way
Mhm.
specifically. We could, take the fact that we would either pay for it ourselves or make them pay for a realtor's appraisal of the land. But what we do now, and because we do it now, is that the system of the assessment act says that they value the land at its current assessed value. They charge the landowner every year a certain amount of money to do that. They charge the town a certain amount of money on top of that to determine what that assessment is. So we use the assessed value current to that year for the land that's being proposed to be subdivided.
Okay.
If there's a home on it, then I ask the SMB to just give me the land value only, and they can do that.
Okay. So I think, I think that's the practice that it seems most common sense, but it does leave cash on the table because of the fact that assessed value and market values are increasingly further apart.
But it makes somebody that's got 150 acre, which the province considers timberland,
Yes.
and you think, well, if I was gonna buy that, I would buy that for $250,000.
Their evaluation.
Somebody actually does buy it for $250,000,
Exactly.
but they say it's still timberland and it's only valued at $2,500.
Oh, I just watched a sale for a lot in Prince of Wales. They sold it for $1.2 million and it's assessed at like $30,000.
Wow.
So
I cry when I see that.
it's just like that to like something that's a mess there. But I guess what I'm looking at is if that's the practice, I think that's completely fine because it's aligned with the best information we have available. I think we keep an eye on it because the assessment folks are continuously saying they're going to change the formula around the assessed value of vacant lands. Because they don't currently account for things like zoning, they don't account for infrastructure. So you'll see vacant lands in urban centers valued under 100,000. We see that often. So in actuality, a lot off of River Valley Drive, even if it's vacant, should be assessed at a much higher value than a lot that has no frontage, that is behind somebody's house. So as long as we're keeping that in mind, I think that's.
And we do it, I mean, sometimes it surprises people that they have a house on it already, but it's a large lot, and they create a lot off of it. And the surprise is, well, how come this vacant lot that used to be just part of my lot is now worth not as much as my lot?
Yeah.
Well, now it's a lot, and
Yeah.
it didn't used to be a lot.
And I think there's a mechanism here to say, if you disagree with so we don't want to force folks, I wouldn't advise forcing folks through an appraisal process. It's entirely too onerous. However, there is an option that if folks disagree with the town's market value evaluation, that they can go through that process. I don't imagine anyone will, because it'll end up with them paying more right now.
But no developer has been upset that we're using the assessed value.
So I will say that it is helpful to have some sort of direction on who is providing that assessment in terms of the market value, where that's coming from. And we can point to the development officer, but then ultimately it's approved by PAC and then by council. So
We need the reference service because that's
because of the
That's-
assessed action.
Do the assessments,
corporation, that's its role.
Right, but I mean, you're distilling that information, so I guess that's what I'm pointing at there.
But it's on the website anyway, right, David?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, everybody can look them up.
Yeah.
So it's not really market value then, is it? It's
So that's
It's
my,
assessed.
that's why I likely won't put the assessed value, but it's like data from Service New Brunswick. Because who knows, at some point they may decide to flirt with market value. We don't know what's coming down the pipe because housing is, it's a big deal at the moment and will continue to be difficult to navigate. Okay, that's it for me this evening. I've taken up enough of your time. I really appreciate though your feedback. I'll be here next month. So next month you'll see a more finalized copy, which won't have all of these edits. And you'll also see a Schedule A as part of the preparations. I will make every effort possible to give that to you well in advance. I'll work with David to make sure that you're not getting it, perhaps not getting it Friday, perhaps getting it a few days before that so that you have some extra time to go through it. Because Schedule A is going to be, it'll just be very technical. There'll be a lot of numbers and a lot of measurements. So that's even more dry than a regular bylaw.
And if we have anything else about the things that we've covered tonight, we can just reach out to David. Yeah.
So I will kind of set a very soft deadline at the end of the week. I know that everybody's busy though, so if it has to come through, if you need time to sift through it on the weekend, feel free. But David will send me hopefully final comments by Monday, and then I'll start incorporating everything into one document.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Yes.
Could I have a motion, please, to table this to the June 6th meeting, please?
I'll make a motion.
Seconder,
Second.
contrary minded? Motion carried. Heather, can you let the record reflect that Kathy is with us tonight?
Sorry.
And item 10 is, can I have a motion to adjourn, please? At 9:12.
So moved.
Second it?
Second.
Okay, that concludes this evening's meeting. Thank you all.
Heather, do you want to come back?